The moment I saw the notice, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a typical HOA letter, the kind you throw in the recycling without a second thought. This one was different, urgent, threatening. It accused me of structural negligence, claimed my retaining wall posed a critical hazard, and demanded immediate compliance. $16 million. That's the number that flashed in my mind. Unthinkable, impossible, crushing. And the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't about safety, it was about control. And somewhere behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and white picket fences, someone had decided to target me. But why? And how far would they go to see me destroyed? Before everything unraveled, my life in the Ridgeview Highlands community was simple, predictable, even peaceful. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house looked like it had been copy-pasted from the same brochure. Fresh paint, trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers. People waved while walking their dogs, kids rode bikes along perfectly smooth sidewalks. And for years, I thought I understood how this place worked. I bought my home for the same reason most people did: quiet streets, good schools, and the promise that the HOA kept everything under control. They sold it as a safeguard, a system to protect property values, a board of volunteers who simply wanted the best for the community. And at first, it felt true. My days were spent working from my small home office, the window facing the backyard where the retaining wall stood, strong, steady, and unnoticed, just like it had been for decades. A stone barrier holding back a gentle slope of earth, nothing more, nothing less. The kind of structure you forget even exists because it never gives you a reason to think about it. I lived alone, but I wasn't isolated. My neighbors were polite, sometimes overly polite. The couple next door, the Harpers, loved to comment on yard improvements like they were reading off a checklist the HOA secretly handed them. The president, Margaret Rhodes, carried a clipboard everywhere she went, as if the entire neighborhood was one long inspection. But even then, I never imagined conflict. I never imagined war. The HOA meetings came and went with the usual topics: landscaping updates, noise complaints, a debate about mailbox colors that lasted 3 full sessions. People cared about the smallest things here, almost to an obsessive degree. But again, it didn't seem dangerous, just annoying, just typical. Looking back, there were signs, little moments I dismissed because they didn't make sense at the time. The wall behind my property, for example. One afternoon, I noticed a few people, strangers, standing near it, pointing and taking pictures. They wore reflective vests, the kind surveyors use, but they weren't measuring anything. They weren't marking the ground. They were just staring at that wall, my wall. When I approached, they left without explanation. Then came the sudden interest from the HOA. Margaret began asking strange questions. Have you noticed any shifting soil? Any drainage issues you need to report? Any cracks forming behind the garden beds? I answered honestly, no, no, and no. Everything was normal. The wall was fine. But she didn't seem relieved. She seemed disappointed, almost like she needed something to be wrong. Around this time, neighbors stopped being quite as friendly. Conversations became shorter, eye contact became rarer. And whenever I walked by the HOA office on Elmwood Lane, blinds shifted and silhouettes moved away from the windows, like someone didn't want to be seen. Still, I tried to ignore it. People gossip, boards overreach, it happens in communities everywhere. I convinced myself it was nothing more than typical HOA weirdness. But deep down, something in the air had changed. The tone of the letters they sent out, the sudden walkthroughs around my property, the way they whispered to each other at meetings when I entered the room. It was subtle, soft, like a pressure building in the background. And then came the survey flags. Bright orange markers suddenly appeared behind my fence one morning, poking out of the soil like warnings. No one told me why they were there. No one asked permission. By the time I walked outside, 3 workers were already walking the line of my retaining wall again, looking at it like it was a ticking bomb. When I asked what they were doing, they offered vague explanations: assessment, routine checks, community compliance. But they wouldn't look me in the eyes, and they didn't seem confident in their own answers. Something was off. Something was coming. I just didn't know what. Not yet. What I did know, what I could feel, was that the quiet life I once had in Ridgeview Highlands was slipping. The peace I took for granted was beginning to crack, and somewhere behind closed doors, people were talking about me, planning something, preparing for a conflict I didn't even know existed. But everything, the rumors, the long stares, the mysterious inspections, was only the beginning. Because soon, the HOA would make a claim so massive, so unbelievable, it would drag me into the biggest fight of my life. And it would all start with a single devastating accusation about that old retaining wall in my backyard. The one they suddenly couldn't stop looking at. The first sign that something was wrong didn't look dangerous at all. It looked ordinary, almost harmless. A single yellow notice taped to my front door. The kind of paper you'd expect to see after a missed package delivery. But the moment I peeled it off and read the fine print, I felt a strange, heavy pressure forming in my chest. It was from the HOA, and according to the letter, an urgent structural review of my retaining wall had been completed without my knowledge. The HOA claimed there were visible signs of critical failure. No details, no photos, no explanation, just a warning. And a deadline. At first, I didn't panic. After all, my retaining wall was reinforced concrete, built only 5 years ago by a licensed contractor the HOA had approved themselves. It had passed inspections. It had never shifted or cracked. But the letter didn't read like a suggestion. It read like an accusation waiting to explode. It felt like the start of something bigger, something I couldn't yet see. Within 24 hours, the HOA's behavior intensified. Margaret Rhodes, the HOA president with the habit of smiling like she knew something no one else did, appeared outside my fence with 2 board members. They weren't talking, just pointing. Not at anything specific, just at my yard, my garden, my retaining wall, and even the slope behind my house that bordered the protected greenbelt. Their presence felt invasive, but the way they kept whispering, glancing toward my home, and jotting things into clipboards made something clear. This wasn't a routine inspection. It was a hunt. And I didn't know why. Then the survey flags returned, dozens of them. Bright orange and pink stakes were suddenly scattered across the bottom of my slope like a coded message. No one asked permission. No one rang the doorbell. Workers simply appeared at dawn, carrying tripods, scanners, and measuring tools. They spoke quietly among themselves and avoided eye contact. The entire scene felt like a secret investigation happening in plain sight. And every time I tried to approach them, they spread out, distancing themselves as if I were a threat. Within a week, the HOA sent a second notice. This time, the language was harsher. The wall was now being described as an imminent hazard, a liability to community safety, a catastrophic risk requiring immediate action. But the strangest part, nothing about the wall had changed. There were no cracks, no shifting, no erosion, no water damage. The wall looked as clean and solid as the day it was built. But the HOA didn't need proof. They only needed paperwork. And the paperwork kept growing. Soon, the letters became more forceful, threatening fines, threatening liens, threatening legal intervention. And each notice ended with the same line: failure to comply may result in severe financial consequences. By then, I began to suspect something I hadn't dared to consider before. Someone was pushing for this. Someone wanted me cornered. Someone inside the HOA was orchestrating a narrative. And I wasn't wrong. The next wave came harder. A new inspection was scheduled, this time with a third-party engineering firm hired directly by the HOA. The inspection team arrived in matching vests, carrying drones and high-resolution cameras. They mapped every inch of my property. They hovered the drone along the retaining wall for over an hour, capturing footage from every possible angle, all without ever telling me what they were looking for. The feeling of being targeted grew heavier, like a slow tightening grip around my life. Then came the emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't have to be. Residents whispered about it for days afterward. About how Margaret stood at the front of the meeting room holding thick binders of documents. About how she spoke with grave seriousness, warning that my retaining wall posed an unacceptable threat to the entire hillside. About how she insisted the HOA had no choice but to intervene aggressively.
about how she pushed for legal measures before the engineering report was even finished. And that was the moment residents began to turn. People who once waved at me now avoided eye contact. The story had spread faster than truth could keep up with it. And the HOA wasn't interested in slowing it down. That isolation was its own kind of punishment. Days later, another notice arrived, thicker, heavier, and far more ominous. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a warning. It was a bill for $16 million. The HOA accused me of endangering the structural stability of the entire hillside community and demanded I pay for the complete demolition and reconstruction of the private retaining system. It didn't matter that my wall was structurally separate. It didn't matter that my engineering plans had been approved years earlier. It didn't matter that no expert had declared the wall unsafe. The HOA claimed I was liable, and they were treating their accusation as fact.